Hey guys, tonight we're training a medieval knight. Not inspiring him. Not motivating him. Not telling him stories about honor, glory, or becoming the best version of himself. But before we get started, make sure that you subscribed and comment me where are you watching from. Just training him. Quietly. Repeatedly. Without enthusiasm. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, subscribe if you genuinely enjoy this kind of thing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always like seeing how far boredom can travel. Now dim the lights, settle in, and let's begin. Training a medieval knight was not about ambition. It was not about passion. It was not about discovering inner strength. Inner strength implied introspection, and introspection often led to opinions. Opinions were inefficient. The goal of training was not to make the knight feel powerful. The goal was to make the knight functional. Predictable. Durable. And most importantly, obedient without needing encouragement. A medieval knight was not trained by asking what he wanted to become. He was trained by removing the concept of wanting altogether. Motivation was unreliable. Motivation fluctuated. Some days it appeared. Some days it did not. Training could not depend on something so emotionally unstable. Instead, medieval systems relied on routine. And repetition. And the quiet understanding that whether you felt like training or not was irrelevant. Training began early. Very early. Not because early mornings built character, but because early mornings removed choice. When you wake someone before their body agrees with the idea of being awake, you bypass negotiation entirely. Bells rang. Voices called. Sometimes sticks knocked against doors. There was no snooze. There was no gradual rising. There was only standing up because everyone else was standing up, and not standing up would be noticed, and being noticed was rarely beneficial. The first lesson of training was not combat. It was compliance. Learning to move when told. Learning to stand where told. Learning to repeat an action until it stopped feeling like an action and started feeling like background noise. Motivation was replaced with momentum. You did not need to want to train if training simply happened to you every day. There were no pep talks. No speeches about greatness. No reminders that today was important. Every day was the same, and that sameness was the point. When every day feels identical, individual days stop mattering. And when days stop mattering, resistance fades. You train because it is Tuesday. And you trained yesterday because it was Monday. And you will train tomorrow because it will be Wednesday. Not because it means something. But because that is how time works here. Physical training was relentless, but not dramatic. Swinging weapons was not about flair. It was about muscle memory. You lifted the sword. You lowered the sword. You repeated. Slowly. Carefully. Incorrect movements were corrected immediately. Not with shouting. Shouting suggested emotion. Emotion suggested disorder. Corrections were brief, precise, and unemotional. Do it again. Slower. Again. Again. You trained until your arms stopped complaining and started obeying. Fatigue was expected. Complaining was not. There was a difference between being tired and expressing tiredness. One was natural. The other was unnecessary. Knights learned quickly that silence conserved energy. Talking cost more effort than enduring. Armor training came early, because armor changed everything. Wearing armor was not empowering. It was humbling. It restricted movement. It trapped heat. It amplified every mistake. Training without armor was theoretical. Training with armor was reality. And reality was heavy. Knights learned to move efficiently not because someone told them to, but because inefficiency hurt. Running in armor was not about speed. It was about persistence. Short distances. Repeated endlessly. Not until you collapsed. Just until you understood that collapse was optional if you paced yourself properly. Training taught conservation. Every movement had a cost. You learned to spend energy carefully because you had no guarantee of getting more. Weapon drills were boring by design. Excitement led to sloppiness. Sloppiness led to injury. Injury led to paperwork, and medieval institutions hated paperwork almost as much as they hated individuality. So drills were slow. Controlled. Predictable. The same sequence repeated until your mind wandered and your body continued anyway. This was intentional. Training without motivation required removing the mind from the equation. Thinking slowed reaction. Feeling interfered with timing. The goal was action without deliberation. Not bravery. Not courage. Just response. There was no reward at the end of training. No praise. No acknowledgement of improvement. Improvement was expected. Lack of improvement was noticed. That imbalance mattered. When effort receives no praise, it stops seeking validation. When failure receives correction, behavior adjusts quietly. Knights were not trained to feel proud of progress. Pride was dangerous. Pride encouraged comparison. Comparison encouraged resentment. Resentment encouraged thought. And thought once again was inefficient. Group training reinforced this system. You trained together, but not socially. You were aware of others without engaging with them. If someone fell behind, no one cheered them on. If someone excelled, no one congratulated them. Everyone was simply present, moving through the same motions, occupying the same time. This created a strange effect. Individual identity blurred. You were not better or worse. You were earlier or later. More precise or less precise. These were temporary states, not personal traits. Tomorrow would reset everything anyway. Instruction was minimal. Demonstration mattered more than explanation. Showing required less interpretation than telling. Telling allowed misunderstanding. Demonstrating simply existed. You watched. You copied. You failed quietly. You adjusted. Training injuries were common, but they were treated pragmatically. Pain was not ignored, but it was not dramatized. If you could continue, you did. If you could not, you were removed temporarily and returned as soon as possible. Injury did not exempt you from routine. It merely modified your participation. This reinforced an important lesson. Your body mattered. Your comfort did not. Mental training was subtle. There were no lessons labeled mental toughness. Instead, mental resilience emerged from repetition. From boredom. From predictability. When nothing changes, the mind stops expecting change. When expectations disappear, frustration weakens. Knights learn to endure monotony. And monotony, it turns out, is harder than chaos. Chaos engages attention. Monotony erodes it slowly. Training without motivation relied on this erosion. You stopped resisting not because you were convinced, but because resistance required energy you no longer wished to spend. Authority was ever present but understated. Commands were brief. Corrections were immediate. Praise was almost non-existent. The absence of feedback became feedback itself. Silence meant acceptable. Attention meant adjustment. Over time, knights internalized the system. Training no longer felt imposed. It simply happened. Days passed. Muscles adapted. Movements sharpened. And at no point did anyone say, "You are becoming a knight." You just were one, eventually, because the routine had shaped you into one without asking your permission. And this continued. Day after day. Drill after drill. Not building excitement. Not inspiring greatness. Just slowly, methodically, replacing individuality with function. And the remarkable thing is, it worked. Not because knights loved training. Not because they believed in it. But because belief was never required, training continued in the same way it always did. Quietly. Without announcement. Without any sense that today was different from yesterday. If yesterday had been difficult, today did not acknowledge it. If yesterday had been easy, today did not reward it. Difficulty and ease were treated the same way, as temporary conditions that did not deserve comment. By this point, the knight had learned something important, though no one had explained it to him. Effort was expected regardless of outcome. Success was not celebrated. Failure was not condemned. Both were absorbed into the routine and processed through repetition. This removed fear. Not courage-based fearlessness, but something more subtle. When nothing remarkable happens, whether you succeed or fail, the emotional stakes disappear. You simply do the movement again. This is how training without motivation works. You remove consequences that invite emotion and replace them with continuity. The body adapted faster than the mind. Muscles strengthened. Balance improved. Movement smoothed out. The mind, meanwhile, slowly stopped asking questions. At first, thoughts wandered. How long will this take? Why this drill again? Why so slow? Why not rest? Over time, these thoughts lost urgency. They appeared, lingered briefly, then dissolved under the weight of repetition. Eventually, training felt less like an activity and more like a condition. Like weather. You did not ask why it was raining. You adjusted your cloak and kept walking. Weapon handling became automatic. Hands knew where to go before instructions arrived. Grip adjusted without conscious effort. Footwork aligned itself naturally. When corrections came, they felt less like criticism and more like calibration. Small adjustments to a system already in motion. There was no sense of progress in the modern way. No milestones. No visible leveling up. Improvement was gradual and deliberately unremarkable. If someone asked you whether you were better than last month, you would struggle to answer. But if you were placed next to your earlier self, the difference would be undeniable. Training sessions were long, but not intense in bursts. They were steady. Controlled. Designed to wear you down gently rather than overwhelm you suddenly. Exhaustion that creeps in slowly is harder to resist than exhaustion that arrives dramatically. Dramatic exhaustion invites drama. Quiet exhaustion invites compliance. Breaks existed, but they were functional, not restorative. Enough time to breathe. Enough time to drink water. Not enough time to relax. Relaxation was the enemy. Relaxation allowed reflection. Reflection allowed doubt. So breaks ended just before comfort appeared. Supervision was constant but understated. Instructors did not hover. They watched. From a distance. Noting patterns rather than incidents. One mistake was nothing. Repeated mistakes were something. Praise was replaced by the absence of correction. When no one spoke to you for days, it meant you were doing it right. This created an interesting internal shift. Knights stopped seeking approval and started seeking invisibility. Being unnoticed became the goal. To move correctly enough that attention passed over you and settled elsewhere. Attention was not punishment, but it was disruption. Disruption interrupted the rhythm. Rhythm was safety. Armor drills grew longer. Wearing heavy gear became less noticeable. Not because it became lighter, but because the body adjusted expectations. The armor was no longer something you put on. It was something you existed inside. Movement accounted for it automatically. Falls happened. Everyone fell. Armor changed balance. Wet ground changed traction. Fatigue changed judgment. Falling was treated as information. You learned how to fall. How to rise. How to resume position without assistance. No one rushed to help unless help was necessary. Necessity was a high bar. Pain became familiar, but not intimate. It existed, but it was not examined closely. Attention was directed outward, toward position, timing, alignment. Pain that was ignored often receded into the background. Pain that was focused on grew louder. Training taught you, indirectly, where to place your awareness. There were days when morale dipped, though no one used that word. You could feel it in the pace. Movement slightly slower. Adjustments slightly delayed. On those days, nothing changed. Training did not become easier. It did not become harder. It simply continued. And morale, deprived of attention, passed on its own. Competition was discouraged. Not explicitly. No one said, "Do not compete." But systems were arranged so that competition had nowhere to land. No scores were kept. No rankings announced. No visible rewards offered. If you tried to measure yourself against others, you did so privately, and private competition eventually exhausted itself. This prevented resentment. It also prevented pride. Both were inefficient. Instructions were rarely explained. Do this was sufficient. Why was unnecessary. Over time, knights stopped asking even internally. Curiosity dulled. Not entirely. Just enough. Enough to prevent distraction. The result was a kind of calm focus. Not excitement. Not passion. Just readiness. A state of being prepared without feeling alert. Alertness required effort. Readiness was passive. Training environments reinforced this mindset. Open yards. Stone floors. Minimal decoration. Nothing to draw the eye. Nothing to stimulate imagination. Visual simplicity supported mental simplicity. You focused on what moved. And most things did not move. Weather did not cancel training. Rain trained balance. Cold trained endurance. Heat trained restraint. Discomfort was reframed as variation. Variation prevented boredom from becoming unbearable. Just enough change to maintain compliance. Over months and years, this system produced knights who did not rely on motivation. They did not need encouragement to act. They did not need inspiration to persist. They moved because movement was expected. They endured because endurance was normal. And when battle came, which was always the unspoken destination of all this monotony, motivation was still unnecessary. Orders arrived. Bodies responded. Fear appeared, but it was secondary. Habit was primary. That was the quiet brilliance of training without motivation. It did not remove fear. It made fear irrelevant. After training sessions ended, there was no decompression. No celebration of effort. You transitioned directly into the next obligation. Meals. Prayer. Maintenance. Sleep. The rhythm continued uninterrupted. Training was not a special event. It was simply one block in the day, like eating or standing or waiting. This integration mattered. When training feels separate, it feels optional. When training is embedded, it becomes unavoidable. Over time, knights stopped remembering when training began or ended. It blurred into daily life. Sword drills felt no different from walking. Wearing armor felt no different from wearing clothing. Discipline stopped feeling imposed and started feeling natural. At no point did anyone say, "You are ready now." Readiness was not declared. It was assumed. And that assumption shaped everything that followed. The system did not care how you felt about it. And because of that, it did not need you to feel anything at all. As time went on, training began to do something subtle. It stopped feeling like effort. Not because it became easy, but because effort stopped being evaluated. When you no longer measure how hard something is, difficulty loses its power. Movements happened. Muscles responded. Breathing adjusted. There was no internal commentary narrating the experience. Narration required distance. Training removed distance. This was not accidental. Medieval systems understood something intuitively that modern systems often forget. If you keep people busy enough, long enough, they stop needing to believe in what they are doing. Belief is loud. Routine is quiet. Quiet lasts longer. The knight no longer counted repetitions. Counting created anticipation. Anticipation created impatience. Instead, drills continued until they stopped. The end arrived without announcement. One moment you were swinging. The next moment you were standing still, waiting for the next instruction. Time lost its edges. Waiting became a skill. Standing in place without shifting weight. Holding equipment without fidgeting. Keeping eyes forward without scanning. These were trained as deliberately as strikes and blocks. Restlessness was corrected early, because restlessness spread. One shifting foot became many. Many shifting feet became disorder. So stillness was practiced. Not the peaceful stillness of meditation. The functional stillness of readiness. Muscles engaged just enough. Mind alert just enough. Anything more was waste. Silence remained constant. Silence removed comparison. Without conversation, you could not easily assess how others felt. Without assessing others, you focused inward less. Attention stayed on task. Even thoughts learned to quiet themselves, out of habit rather than instruction. Mistakes continued to happen. They always would. But the emotional response to mistakes faded. There was no embarrassment, because embarrassment required an audience that cared. There was no frustration, because frustration required expectation. Expectations had been trained out. Correction arrived, you adjusted, and the moment passed. Nothing lingered. Lingering was inefficient. As the knight aged within the system, he noticed something else. New trainees arrived with tension in their movements. Shoulders tight. Grips too firm. Eyes searching for approval or reassurance. They trained harder than necessary. They wasted energy. And slowly, quietly, the system smoothed them down. No one told them to relax. Relaxation was not the goal. Efficiency was. Efficiency emerged when unnecessary effort burned itself out. The knight himself no longer remembered what training felt like before this. The early discomforts had faded into an indistinct memory. What remained was capability. Not confidence. Capability did not need confidence. Confidence was emotional. Capability was structural. Equipment maintenance became part of training. Cleaning armor. Checking straps. Sharpening blades. These tasks were repetitive, quiet, and essential. Neglect showed immediately in performance. Attention to detail was reinforced without lectures. If your gear failed, the lesson was obvious. This created responsibility without discussion. You cared for your equipment because doing so prevented problems. Not because someone praised diligence. Not because negligence was morally condemned. Because consequences were direct and unavoidable. Training also taught patience. Progress was slow. Improvement was incremental. There were no shortcuts. Anyone attempting to rush ahead exposed themselves quickly. Sloppy technique led to inefficiency. Inefficiency led to fatigue. Fatigue led to correction. So knights learned to trust the process, not because they believed in it, but because resisting it was exhausting. Over long periods, something resembling calm settled in. Not happiness. Not satisfaction. A steadiness. A sense that whatever happened next, the body would respond appropriately. This steadiness was the true product of training. It extended beyond the training ground. Walking became measured. Movements became economical. Even sitting changed. Less shifting. Less fidgeting. The body learned how to exist without excess motion. Emotions followed the body's lead. High emotion required high energy. Energy was conserved. Emotional spikes flattened. This did not remove feeling entirely. It narrowed the range. Extremes faded. What remained was manageable. Training without motivation produced knights who did not panic easily. Panic required sudden change. Sudden change had been normalized. Weather changed. Orders changed. Routines adjusted. Adaptation was constant. When commands arrived unexpectedly, they were followed without hesitation. Not because of loyalty. Not because of belief. Because response had been practiced more than hesitation ever could be. This was perhaps the most important outcome. The absence of hesitation. Hesitation was where fear lived. Remove hesitation, and fear arrived too late to interfere. Even exhaustion became familiar. Not something to dread. Something to recognize and manage. Knights learned how close they could approach their limits without crossing them. Limits were not explored dramatically. They were approached cautiously and respected. Training days blended together. Weeks disappeared. Seasons passed. The knight did not track them closely. Time was measured and routines completed, not dates remembered. Occasionally, there were changes. New drills. Modified formations. Slight adjustments in technique. These were introduced quietly, without explanation. You noticed them by doing them. Questions were unnecessary. Adaptation occurred through repetition. This avoided resistance. Resistance required comparison to a previous state. When changes were introduced gently, there was no clear before and after. Only now. Eventually, training reached a point where it no longer felt like something being done to the knight. It felt like something happening through him. This was not enlightenment. It was not mastery in any romantic sense. It was simply the absence of friction. Actions flowed because there was nothing left inside to argue with them. The knight noticed this most clearly during moments that would once have caused hesitation. A dropped weapon. A sudden command. An unexpected shift in formation. Earlier in training, these moments had triggered a brief pause, a mental recalculation. Now, the body responded first. The mind followed later, quietly, almost apologetically. This was not because the knight had become faster at thinking. He had become slower at thinking. And that was an improvement. Training days still began early. The body woke before the bell sometimes, not from eagerness, but from conditioning. Muscles anticipated movement. The absence of movement felt strange. Stillness outside of schedule became uncomfortable. Rest days were rare, and when they arrived, they felt unsettling. Too much space. Too much time. The system preferred occupation. When rest was enforced, it was structured. Cleaning. Inspection. Quiet tasks that filled the hours without taxing the body. True leisure did not exist. Leisure invited reflection. Reflection invited comparison. Comparison invited dissatisfaction. So even rest served discipline. The knight's relationship with effort changed. Effort was no longer something to summon. It was something that appeared automatically when required. There was no internal debate. The question, "Do I feel like this?" no longer arose. Feelings were not consulted. This extended into pain. Pain still existed, but it no longer dominated attention. The knight learned to distinguish between pain that required action and pain that required patience. This distinction was never explained. It was learned through repetition and consequence. Training injuries were treated the same way training mistakes were. Addressed. Corrected. Integrated. The body adapted around limitations. A sore joint changed grip. A stiff muscle altered stance. Training adjusted without complaint. Complaint, by now, felt pointless. Not forbidden. Just irrelevant. As years passed, training shaped posture. Knights stood differently. Weight balanced evenly. Movements economical. Even when unarmored, their bodies carried the memory of armor. Shoulders squared. Steps measured. The body remembered weight even when it was absent. New recruits noticed this before they understood it. Senior knights moved less, but accomplished more. They wasted no energy. Their presence alone communicated expectation. No instructions were needed. Watching was enough. This was how knowledge transferred. Not through teaching, but through imitation. Explanation introduced interpretation. Imitation bypassed it. Training sessions sometimes extended into night. Torchlight flickered. Shadows stretched. The environment changed, but the routine did not. This taught adaptability without excitement. Darkness was just another condition. Noise was just another variable. The knight learned that most obstacles were simply unfamiliar conditions. Once experienced, they lost their power. Training reduced novelty. Reduced novelty reduced fear. Fear, when it appeared, was quiet. It did not explode. It did not freeze. It hovered at the edge of awareness, acknowledged but not indulged. The body continued moving. Fear followed behind, unable to interfere. This was not courage in the heroic sense. Courage implied decision. This was momentum. The absence of motivation produced an unexpected effect. Training became strangely calming. Not pleasant. Calming. Predictable exertion stabilized the mind. Uncertainty existed outside the training ground, but inside it, everything was known. That knowledge created a kind of refuge. When the world beyond the walls shifted unpredictably, training remained the same. Sword up. Sword down. Step. Turn. Repeat. This constancy mattered. It anchored the night. Even as politics shifted, commanders changed, and campaigns loomed, training provided continuity. It did not promise safety. It promised familiarity. Familiarity was enough. Eventually, training merged completely with identity. The knight did not think of himself as someone who trained. He was someone who functioned this way. Training was no longer preparation. It was maintenance. Like eating. Like sleeping. Like prayer. When battle occurred, it felt strangely similar. Noise increased. Chaos intruded. But underneath, movements were familiar. Positioning. Timing. Awareness. The body did not need new instructions. It executed old ones in a new environment. After battle, training resumed unchanged. There was no acknowledgement of experience. No processing. No reflection encouraged. Reflection lingered too long on what had happened. Training redirected attention toward what was happening now. This prevented trauma from taking root in obvious ways. Not because trauma did not exist, but because it was never given space to unfold. Everything was absorbed into routine and flattened by repetition. This had costs. Emotional depth narrowed. Sensitivity dulled. But in exchange, functionality endured. The knight no longer expected fulfillment from training. Or from anything else. Expectation itself had been quietly removed from the system. What remained was capacity. And capacity was enough. So training continued. Not building toward a climax. Not working toward an end. Just repeating, maintaining, preserving. A machine does not need motivation to run. It needs structure. And the medieval training system understood this deeply. As the routine persisted, something else happened that no one ever formally acknowledged. The knight stopped distinguishing between training and the rest of life. The boundary dissolved. Movements practiced in the yard appeared naturally while walking corridors, lifting objects, even turning to look at someone speaking. Efficiency leaked into everything. This was not conscious. Conscious adjustment would have required attention. This was deeper than attention. It was habit settling into bone. The knight no longer remembered learning these movements. They simply existed. Asking him how he knew where to place his feet would have been like asking how he knew where to place his tongue when speaking. The question itself felt unnecessary. Training schedules remained rigid. The same hours. The same order. Variation was minimal and deliberate. Change happened slowly enough that resistance never formed. When drills shifted, it felt less like something new and more like something slightly different that had always been there. This was important. Sudden change demanded adaptation. Gradual change allowed absorption. Instructors aged. Some left. Some died. New ones took their place. Training did not acknowledge this. Commands sounded the same. Corrections felt the same. Authority was not tied to personality. It was embedded in the role. The system outlived individuals easily. This taught another lesson quietly. You were replaceable. Not in a cruel sense. In a structural sense. The system did not pause for absence. It adjusted and continued. That knowledge did not inspire despair. Despair required emotional investment. Instead, it created a kind of acceptance. You did your part while you were here. The system did not ask for more. Fatigue still appeared, but it was different now. Not sharp. Not urgent. A dull presence that accompanied movement like background noise. The knight learned to operate alongside it. Fighting fatigue wasted energy. Coexisting with it conserved energy. Training reinforced pacing. Going too hard too fast resulted in correction. Slowing down too much also resulted in correction. There was an optimal middle that revealed itself over time. Finding it required attention at first. Later, it happened automatically. This extended to breathing. Early training emphasized breath control explicitly. Later, breath adjusted itself. Shallow when still. Deep when moving. The body learned how much oxygen it needed without being told. The mind mirrored this efficiency. Thoughts became shorter. Less elaborate. Long internal monologues faded. Decisions simplified. When options appeared, the correct one felt obvious. Not because it was objectively correct, but because training had narrowed acceptable responses. This narrowing was intentional. Too many options slowed reaction. Fewer options increased reliability. The knight noticed that when unexpected situations arose outside training, people reacted differently. Some froze. Some overreacted. Some hesitated visibly. He did not judge them. Judgment required distance. He simply noticed that his own response arrived faster, with less effort. That difference felt neither superior nor inferior. Just different. Training also altered the knight's relationship with time. Waiting no longer felt empty. Standing still did not produce impatience. Impatience required expectation of change. Without expectation, time passed without friction. This made long watches easier. Guard duty less taxing. Stillness became another form of readiness rather than a pause between actions. Silence deepened. Not enforced silence. Internal silence. Thoughts arose less frequently. When they did, they were simpler. Immediate. Practical. The future existed only as the next instruction. The past existed only as muscle memory. This reduced anxiety. Anxiety required projection. Projection required imagination. Training starved imagination gently, over years. Some might call this loss. Others might call it peace. The system did not name it at all. Occasionally, a knight would leave the order. Rarely. When it happened, training did not react. The absence was noted administratively and absorbed operationally. The routine continued. Those who remained trained the next day as usual. This reinforced permanence. Not of individuals. Of structure. As the knight grew older, recovery slowed slightly. Training adjusted imperceptibly. Fewer repetitions. More emphasis on precision. Less raw exertion. The system did not discard experience. It redistributed it. Older knights demonstrated. Younger knights imitated. Knowledge transferred without ceremony. No lessons announced. No formal mentoring declared. You learned by standing nearby and watching. Training remained largely joyless. This was not considered a flaw. Joy introduced unpredictability. Unpredictability undermined discipline. Discipline was the priority. And yet, within this lack of joy, there was stability. The knight knew where he would be. What he would do. What would be expected. That certainty replaced enthusiasm with reliability. Reliability was valued more highly. The knight did not wake each morning eager to train. He woke because it was time to wake. He trained because training happened. He rested because rest was scheduled. Desire did not factor into the process. This made performance consistent. Consistency mattered more than peak ability. A reliable knight was more valuable than a passionate one. Over decades, this approach produced men who were difficult to unsettle. Not fearless. Not invincible. Just steady. Steadiness survived chaos. And so the training continued, unchanged in spirit if not in detail. A quiet system shaping quiet effectiveness. Without speeches. Without motivation. Without asking whether it was enough. It was enough because it existed. Over time, the knight stopped thinking of the routine as something external. There was no sense of, the schedule says, or, the rules require. Those ideas had faded. What remained was a simple awareness of what came next. Not anticipation. Not reluctance. Just sequence. Sequence replaced choice. Morning led to movement. Movement led to exertion. Exertion led to maintenance. Maintenance led to rest. Rest led back to morning. The cycle was complete, self-supporting, and required no emotional input. If you removed any part of it, the absence would be felt immediately, like a missing step on a staircase you had walked for years. Training did not make the knight feel powerful. Power implied dominance. Dominance implied ego. Ego required attention. Training removed attention from the self. What it produced instead was capacity. Quiet, unremarkable capacity. This was evident in how the knight handled tools. Weapons were no longer special objects. They were extensions. You did not admire them. You did not think about them. You maintained them because maintenance prevented failure. Failure was inconvenient. The same applied to the body. The body was not admired. It was maintained. Stretched because stiffness reduced efficiency. Fed because hunger distracted. Rested because exhaustion degraded performance. Care was practical, not affectionate. Even injuries were absorbed into this logic. An injured limb was not tragic. It was an adjustment. You compensated. You redistributed effort. You continued. The system discouraged drama not by forbidding it, but by refusing to react to it. Drama requires an audience. Training provided none. Occasionally, someone would arrive from outside the system. A noble observer. A visiting authority. Someone expecting speeches, demonstrations, moments of inspiration. They were usually disappointed. Training looked dull. Repetitive. Almost lazy from a distance. That misunderstanding was common. efficiency often looks unimpressive. The absence of visible strain was mistaken for lack of effort. In reality, effort had simply been optimized out of visibility. The knight did not correct these assumptions. Correction required engagement. Engagement required interest. Interest was unnecessary. Training spaces remained unchanged. The same yard. The same worn ground. The same marks in stone and earth from years of repetition. These marks were not erased. They were allowed to accumulate. They reminded no one of history, but they supported consistency. Familiar ground reduced variables. Weather continued to shape sessions. Wind altered balance. Rain altered footing. Cold altered grip. Heat altered endurance. None of these conditions canceled training. They simply modified it. This taught adaptability without novelty. Adaptability without novelty was important. Novelty excited. Excitement distracted. Training aimed for adaptation that felt ordinary. As the knight matured, his role shifted almost without notice. He corrected others now. Briefly. Quietly. Without instruction manuals or speeches. A gesture. A word. Sometimes just standing nearby until the mistake resolved itself. This was leadership without inspiration. Authority without charisma. Influence without persuasion. You did not follow because you admired. You followed because the movement made sense. Training also stripped away unnecessary motion in speech. When the knight spoke, it was short. Direct. Functional. Not because he was forbidden from elaboration, but because elaboration felt inefficient. Words cost energy. Energy was conserved. Silence, once imposed, now felt natural. At this stage, motivation would have felt strange. Being told, "do your best," would have sounded confusing. Best compared to what? Yesterday. Tomorrow. Someone else. Motivation implied variability. The system had removed variability. You did what was required. Nothing more. Nothing less. That balance was crucial. Excess effort led to fatigue. Insufficient effort led to correction. The middle path was reinforced thousands of times until it became instinct. Instinct replaced intention. The knight noticed that younger trainees struggled most not with physical tasks, but with waiting. Waiting for instruction. Waiting for correction. Waiting for the next repetition. Waiting exposed the mind. The mind, unused to emptiness, filled the space with impatience. Training resolved this slowly. Waiting became just another state. Neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Just present. This ability carried into battle, into guard duty, into long marches. The knight could exist in uncertainty without filling it with anxiety. This was not bravery. It was acclimatization. Acclimatization is quieter than courage. The system never tested motivation directly. It did not ask why you stayed. It did not require reaffirmation. Leaving was possible. Staying required no explanation. This removed pressure. Pressure builds resistance. The absence of pressure allowed compliance to feel voluntary, even when it was not meaningfully so. Years accumulated. The knight aged inside the routine. Training did not stop for age. It adjusted. Less force. More precision. Less repetition. More demonstration. The system did not discard experience. It redistributed it. Eventually, the knight realized something without ever articulating it. Training had not made him exceptional. It had made him dependable. And dependability, in this world, mattered more than excellence. Excellence peaked and faded. Dependability endured. And so the routine continued. Not aiming upward. Not striving outward, just maintaining a level state of readiness that required no motivation to sustain. The bell rang. The body moved. The day unfolded as it always had. As the years settled into one another, the night's sense of beginning and ending weakened. Training sessions no longer started with anticipation or ended with relief. They simply occupied time, like light occupying a room. Present without announcement. Gone without ceremony. The bell still rang. It always rang. But the sound no longer startled or summoned urgency. It was simply information. Sound indicating sequence. Sequence indicating action. Action occurring without commentary. The body responded before the mind acknowledged the signal. Sometimes the knight would realize he was already standing, already moving, only after the movement had begun. This was not dissociation. It was efficiency. Conscious awareness arrived late because it was no longer required at the front of the process. Training had fully migrated beneath thought. There were moments, rare but noticeable, when training was interrupted. A delayed bell. An altered schedule. A cancelled session due to logistics beyond anyone's control. These moments felt strange. Not welcome. Not alarming. Just incomplete. Like a sentence that stopped halfway through. During those pauses, the knight noticed something else. Without the routine, time expanded awkwardly. Thoughts appeared uninvited. Not dramatic thoughts. Small ones. Fragmented ones. Questions without urgency. The system resumed quickly after these moments, and the questions dissolved on their own. Training functioned as containment. Not suppression. Containment. It held attention within a narrow, manageable range. The knight no longer thought of training as preparation for anything specific. Early on, there had been a vague sense of future battle, future trials. That future had arrived and passed multiple times. Training continued regardless. It was no longer aimed at an event. It was aimed at continuity. Continuity was the real objective. This became most clear during transitions. After campaigns. After losses. After changes in command. Training resumed unchanged. It did not process what had happened. It absorbed it by ignoring it. Some might say this prevented healing. Others might say it enabled survival. The system did not debate this. It continued. The knight's movements now carried a quiet confidence that was not confidence at all. It was familiarity. He knew how his body would respond because it always had. Uncertainty existed only at the edges, never at the core. This made him predictable. Predictable to others. Predictable to himself. Predictability reduced fear. The absence of motivation meant the absence of disappointment. When you expect nothing emotionally, nothing emotional can be taken from you. Training did not promise fulfillment. It did not promise meaning. It promised repetition. And it delivered. There was comfort in that honesty. As the knight's hair grayed, his movements slowed slightly, but only slightly. The system compensated. Fewer wasted motions meant less speed was required. Precision replaced force. Timing replaced strength. Younger knights often mistook this for decline. They learned otherwise during drills. Efficiency revealed itself quietly. The older knight did not correct them verbally. He demonstrated. Demonstration ended confusion faster than explanation. This was how wisdom existed here. Not as advice. As visible outcome, training spaces bore the marks of decades. Grooves worn into stone. Compacted earth that never quite softened. These were not maintained deliberately. They were allowed to exist. Familiar imperfections were part of the environment. Removing them would introduce novelty. Novelty was unnecessary. The knight sometimes noticed the world beyond the walls changing. New tools. New methods. New ideas discussed in distant places. Training absorbed only what proved useful. Everything else passed by without resistance or adoption. This selectivity was not strategic. It was conservative. The system valued what worked because it had already worked. Training without motivation favored inertia. Inertia protected consistency. When the knight slept, his dreams were simple. Movements. Sequences. Familiar patterns. Rarely narratives. Rarely faces. The body rehearsed what it knew. Even rest was shaped by routine. Waking felt natural. No grogginess. No resentment. Sleep had not been an escape. It had been another phase in the cycle. At no point did the night feel complete. Completion implied an end. Ends were not part of the system. There was always another session. Another repetition. Another day. This endlessness removed pressure. You did not have to arrive anywhere. You simply had to continue. That expectation was manageable. If someone had asked the knight whether he enjoyed training, the question would have felt oddly framed. Enjoyment required comparison between states. Training had eliminated those comparisons. There was only now. Now was acceptable. This was perhaps the most subtle achievement of training without motivation. It replaced desire with tolerance. Tolerance with habit. Habit with identity. Not identity as self-expression. Identity as function. The knight functioned. And that, in this world, was enough. The bell rang again, feet shifted. Weight adjusted. The body moved. And the routine carried on, steady and unremarkable, doing exactly what it had always done. With enough years inside the routine, even the idea of endurance changed. Endurance was no longer about pushing through difficulty. Difficulty implied resistance. Endurance became the absence of resistance altogether. You did not endure the routine. You existed within it. The knight noticed this most clearly during moments that once would have tested him. Long drills. Repetitive movements under fatigue. Extended silence. These no longer felt like challenges. They felt like weather. Present. Neutral. Unavoidable. And therefore not worth reacting to. Reaction had been trained out. Training had not hardened him in the way story suggested. It had softened edges instead. Smoothed sharp responses. Reduced extremes. The knight was less explosive, but more stable. Less impressive in short bursts, but more reliable across long stretches. Reliability mattered. This reliability showed itself in small things. A strap noticed before it failed. A misstep corrected before it became a fall. A formation adjusted before disorder spread. None of these actions were conscious decisions. They were habits responding to patterns. Patterns had become visible over time. Not because the knight studied them, but because repetition revealed them automatically. When you do the same thing long enough, deviations stand out without effort. Training exploited this. It did not explain patterns. It exposed them repeatedly until recognition became instinctive. The knight's sense of self continued to thin. Not in a disturbing way. In a practical way. Strong opinions faded. Preferences softened. The need to assert individuality diminished. Individuality was not punished. It was simply unused. Unused things fade. When the knight spoke with those outside the system, he noticed the difference. They spoke in intentions. In hopes. In worries. He spoke in observations. In necessities. In sequences. This was not superiority. It was translation difficulty. They lived in possibility. He lived in process. Training favored process. This made long-term thinking unnecessary. Plans existed, but they were broad. Move here. Hold this. Maintain readiness. Details adjusted themselves. The knight did not imagine outcomes. Imagination created emotional investment. Emotional investment created disappointment. Training removed the need to imagine. Even prayer, when present, followed this pattern. Structured. Repetitive. Predictable. Not a conversation. A rhythm. Prayer fit into the day the same way training did. Another cycle. Another pattern. Another way to occupy time without introducing uncertainty. Faith, like training, did not require enthusiasm. It required consistency. The knight noticed that when people around him struggled, they often struggled with things training had removed. Waiting. Uncertainty. Boredom. Lack of feedback. These were not problems for him. They were environments. Training had prepared him for environments, not outcomes. As age continued its slow advance, recovery required more attention. Training adjusted without comment. Warm-ups lengthened. Cool-downs lingered slightly. Precision replaced repetition. No one announced these changes. They emerged naturally, like erosion shaping stone. This adaptability kept the knight functional longer than expected. Not because he was stronger. Because he wasted less. Waste had been the enemy all along. Wasted motion. Wasted thought. Wasted emotion. Training reduced waste systematically, without naming it. The result was quiet sustainability. At no point did the knight feel that he had mastered the system. Mastery implied control. He did not control it. He moved within it. The system carried him as much as he carried it. This mutual reinforcement was its strength. Sometimes, in rare moments of stillness, the knight became aware of how long he had been doing this. Decades compressed into a single sensation of familiarity. The realization did not provoke nostalgia or regret. Those emotions required contrast. There was nothing to contrast against. This was life as it had been lived. Continuously. Without markers. If training had stopped suddenly, the absence would have been felt sharply. Not as loss. As disorientation. Like waking without gravity. The body expected structure. Structure provided meaning without explanation. Meaning had never been the goal. Function had. And function persisted. The bell rang. Not loudly. Not urgently. Just clearly enough to be heard. The knight rose. Not quickly. Not slowly. Exactly as required. Movement resumed. The sequence continued. And the routine, unbroken and uninterested in reflection, carried on doing what it had always done best. Eventually, the routine became so deeply embedded that even disruption failed to disrupt it. When something went wrong, truly wrong, the response was not panic. It was adjustment. Panic required surprise. Surprise required expectation. Training had eroded expectation so thoroughly that very little qualified as unexpected anymore. Orders changed. Conditions worsened. Supplies ran thin. The routine bent without breaking. Training did not prepare the knight for ideal circumstances. It prepared him for continuation under less than ideal ones. Continuation was the metric. The knight noticed that when others became overwhelmed, it was rarely by physical strain alone. It was by uncertainty layered on top of effort. Training had peeled uncertainty away, leaving effort by itself. Effort alone was manageable. This did not make the knight fearless. Fear still appeared, briefly, like a signal light. But it did not linger. Lingering required attention. Attention had been redirected elsewhere long ago. Training also reshaped memory. Events were remembered without emotion attached. Battles were sequences. Marches were distances. Injuries were durations. Memory became factual rather than narrative. Stories faded. Data remained. This was not deliberate. It was a side effect of repetition. When every day followed a similar structure, individual days stopped demanding distinction. Only deviations were noted, and even those faded quickly once resolved. The knight's sense of achievement was muted. Victories did not inflate him. Losses did not collapse him. Both were processed through the same mechanism. What comes next? What must be done? Where to stand? This flattening of emotional response made him dependable in ways that were difficult to explain to those outside the system. Dependability was not visible until it was needed. Training without motivation produced people who did not require reassurance. Reassurance implied doubt. Doubt implied instability. The knight trusted the routine more than his own feelings. Feelings fluctuated. The routine did not. As years passed, the knight's presence alone began to stabilize others. Not through authority. Through predictability. Standing near him, others unconsciously adjusted their pace. Their movements aligned. Order emerged without instruction. This was not leadership as it was spoken about in stories. It was alignment. Alignment required no inspiration. The knight did not think of himself as calm. Calm was a comparison to agitation. He simply was. Whatever state he occupied felt normal. Normality had been redefined by training. Even moments of danger unfolded this way. Heart rate increased. Vision narrowed. The body responded. Afterwards, the state faded. No replay. No rumination. The next task replaced the last. Training had not taught him to suppress thought. It had taught him to replace it quickly. Replacement was easier than resistance. As the knight moved deeper into age, the system continued to accommodate him. Tasks shifted. Roles adjusted. Training remained present, though altered. Demonstration instead of repetition. Observation instead of exertion. Still participation, just quieter. The system did not waste experience. It recycled it. Young knights rarely noticed this transition happening. One day someone was drilling beside them. Later, that same person was standing slightly apart, watching. Offering a correction with 2 words instead of 10. The shift felt natural. No ceremony marked it. Ceremony implied significance. Significance implied emotion. Training avoided both. At this stage, the knight's inner life was sparse. Not empty. Sparse. Thoughts arrived when needed. Left when not. There was no sense of missing anything. Missing required comparison to an imagined alternative. Imagination had long since been trained into dormancy. If someone had asked the knight whether this life was fulfilling, he would not have understood the question. Fulfillment suggested a destination. There was no destination. There was only continuation. Continuation was sufficient. The routine did not promise happiness. It promised stability. Stability allowed survival. Survival allowed function. Function justified the routine. The loop closed neatly, without excess. And so, even now, nothing changed. The bell rang. The body responded. The sequence unfolded. No motivation. No resistance. Just motion sustained by structure. Time continued to pass, but it no longer felt like something that moved forward. It felt like something that accumulated. Layer upon layer of nearly identical days, compressing into a single, dense familiarity. Years stopped feeling long. They felt thick. The knight no longer marked age by numbers. He marked it by adjustments. A different grip. A slower turn. A longer pause before standing. None of these were failures. They were recalibrations. The routine absorbed them without judgment. Judgment had never been part of the system. What surprised the knight most, if anything surprised him at all, was how little effort it took to keep going. Outsiders imagined persistence as a struggle, a daily act of will. They imagined resolve being renewed each morning. That was not how it worked. Willpower was expensive. Training had replaced it with inevitability. You did not decide to train. Training happened. You were present for it. This removed the drama from life. There were no inner speeches. No moments of questioning purpose late at night. Questions still arose occasionally, but they had nowhere to attach. The routine provided an answer without words: this is what happens next. Next was enough. The night's environment continued to change slowly. Stones wore smoother. Tools were replaced. Faces came and went. The routine remained recognizable even as its components shifted. Like a river that keeps its shape while never containing the same water twice. The knight did not form deep attachments in the way others did. Not because he avoided them, but because attachment required emotional bandwidth. Training consumed most of that bandwidth quietly. Relationships existed. Respect existed. Familiarity existed. They simply did not dominate. Loss, when it came, arrived muted. Not painless, but contained. The routine held space where grief might otherwise expand uncontrollably. Movement continued. Structure remained. The loss was carried, not examined. Examination had never been required for continuation. At some point, the knight stopped thinking of himself as an individual moving through the routine. He was part of the routine moving through time. Interchangeable in theory, but shaped uniquely by duration. The system would continue without him someday. That fact did not disturb him. Endings were just another form of change. Occasionally, a younger knight would ask a question that hinted at unease. Why do we do it this way? Does it ever end? Doesn't it get boring? The older knight never answered directly. Direct answers created expectations. Instead, he demonstrated. He showed how to stand without tension. How to move without hurry. How to repeat without irritation. The question usually dissolved on its own. Boredom, the knight had learned, came from wanting something else to be happening. Training removed that desire. There was only what was happening. And what was happening was manageable. Even silence became comfortable. Silence was no longer empty. It was simply unfilled. Training had taught the knight that not everything needed to be filled. As the body slowed further, the routine narrowed. Fewer repetitions. More observation. The knight's presence became quieter, but not weaker. He noticed details others missed. Timing. Posture. Breath. These observations required no effort. They surfaced naturally. Correction was minimal. Often unnecessary. The environment adjusted itself around consistency. At no point did the knight feel wise. Wisdom was a label applied from outside. Internally, there was just familiarity. Long familiarity. When the bell rang now, it felt less like a signal and more like a reminder. Not a reminder of duty, but of rhythm. The day had a shape. The shape would be followed. One day, eventually, the knight would not rise when the bell rang. The routine would continue regardless. That thought did not feel heavy. It felt accurate. Accuracy was comforting. For now, the bell still rang. The body still responded. The sequence still unfolded. And the routine, steady, indifferent, and endlessly repeatable, continued, carrying time forward without ever needing to explain itself. Eventually, even the awareness of continuity softened. The knight no longer thought in terms of still or yet. Those words implied expectation of stopping. Stopping was not part of the internal language anymore. There was only the present arrangement of things. Morning arrived. Not as a beginning. As a condition. Light changed the stone walls gradually, revealing textures already known. The same marks. The same wear. The same quiet evidence of time passing without announcement. The knight registered this without comment, the way one registers temperature or balance. Balance mattered. Balance was something training refined endlessly without ever naming. Weight over feet. Breath matched to motion. Effort distributed evenly so nothing strained first. Balance applied not just to the body, but to the day. No part of it pulled too hard against another. Hunger came. Hunger went. Fatigue came. Fatigue went. None of these states demanded interpretation. They were inputs. Training had taught the knight to treat internal sensations the same way he treated terrain or weather. Information, not instruction, this was why he rarely complained. Complaints were negotiations with reality. Training did not negotiate. It adapted. At some point, the knight realized he no longer remembered when he had last been excited. Not because excitement was forbidden, but because it had no place to land. Excitement needed anticipation. Anticipation needed variance. Variance had been reduced to near zero. What remained was steadiness. Steadiness did not feel good or bad. It felt reliable. People sometimes mistook this for emptiness. They imagined a life drained of color. The knight would not have agreed or disagreed. Color required contrast. His world had gradients, not extremes. Subtle shifts instead of sharp turns. Subtlety was enough. When mistakes happened, and they did happen, they were addressed without ceremony. No self-blame. No lingering analysis. A correction was made. The routine absorbed the correction and moved on. This prevented mistakes from becoming identities. Training did not ask who you were. It asked what you did next. The knight's breathing had changed over the years. Slower. Deeper. Less responsive to stress. This was not trained deliberately. It was a side effect of long exposure to predictable exertion. The body learned there was rarely a reason to rush. Rushing wasted energy. Even in moments that required speed, the speed emerged from readiness, not urgency. Urgency tightened the body. Readiness kept it open. Training favored the second. The knight sometimes watched clouds move overhead during pauses. He did not attach meaning to them. He did not think in metaphors. Clouds moved. That was sufficient. Thoughts still occurred, but they were brief and unsticky. They did not spiral. Spirals required friction. Training had reduced friction by removing choices wherever possible. Choice was heavy. Routine was light. As the knight's role shifted further toward observation, his movements grew fewer but more precise. When he spoke, others listened, not because his words were profound, but because they were rare. Rarity gave them weight without intention. He never raised his voice. Volume was unnecessary. When younger knights struggled with restlessness, he did not advise them to be patient. Patience was an abstract concept. Instead, he extended the drill by one repetition. Restlessness dissolved into motion. Motion was the universal answer. The system did not care whether you liked it. Liking was optional. Participation was not. Over time, the knight noticed that the routine had outlived many things. Commanders. Policies. Conflicts. Even names changed. The routine adapted quietly, shedding labels while retaining structure. Structure was the skeleton beneath everything. There were moments, very quiet ones, when the knight sensed the thinness of the line between presence and absence. Not fear. Awareness. The body was older. Recovery took longer. Still, the routine accommodated. It always had. Accommodation was not kindness. It was efficiency. Nothing here was sentimental. And yet, nothing felt harsh. The bell rang again. Not loudly. Not urgently. It rang because it always rang. The knight shifted his weight. Adjusted his stance. moved when movement was required. And the routine continued, patient, indifferent, and endlessly capable of carrying another day without ever asking why. Time had become almost irrelevant. The night no longer counted days, months, or years. These were measurements for those outside the system, whose lives were marked by beginnings and endings. Inside the routine, only sequence mattered. Action followed action. Breath followed breath. Step followed step. The cycle persisted without reference to calendars. The body moved automatically. The mind followed, observing without interference. Thoughts that once demanded attention had been sorted, relevant ones stayed, distracting ones dissolved. Curiosity existed only insofar as it served the sequence. Wonder, excitement, hesitation, rare, foreign, and fleeting. They were quickly absorbed by habit. Even mistakes lost their sting. When a sword slipped from grip or a misstep occurred, the correction was instantaneous, unconscious. No mental energy wasted on regret. Each error was simply information, absorbed and corrected. Repetition smoothed the edges of imperfection until imperfection itself became negligible. The knight's awareness of others deepened. Not socially. Not emotionally. Mechanically. He noticed tension in posture, uneven breathing, subtle shifts in weight. These were signals to adjust formations, to compensate, to anticipate movement before it became necessary. Leadership had become invisible. It was in the effect, not the intent. The environment remained a teacher. Weather, light, sound, and terrain provided constant feedback. Rain altered grip. Mud slowed footing. Wind challenged balance. The knight responded without conscious thought. The system had trained him to integrate input seamlessly. Adaptation was no longer deliberate. It was instinctive. Even internal states became predictable. Hunger, fatigue, alertness, and pain were treated as data points rather than experiences. If the body ached, it adjusted. If the stomach protested, it reminded him of rationed intake. Discomfort existed only as information. Response replaced reaction, long periods of stillness now revealed patterns unnoticed before. The knight watched younger recruits flail in uncertainty, hesitating between options, weighing trivial choices. He understood why. Their minds were untrained. Unfiltered. Full of expectation. Training had pruned the extraneous. He moved through the day with purpose, while others struggled with potential. Routine carried memory and experience without the need for reflection. The knight no longer consciously recalled victories, failures, or lessons learned. He remembered them only through muscle, posture, timing, and breath. Memory had migrated into movement. Thought followed body, not the other way around. Even sleep obeyed structure. Rest was functional. Dreams were sequences of familiar actions, sometimes repetitions of drills or marches. No narrative. No drama. Just rehearsal. Waking felt like resuming a pattern rather than starting a day. The rhythm persisted uninterrupted, like a river flowing through a landscape indifferent to history. Pain, once disruptive, had become negotiable. Training had taught the difference between signals that demanded cessation and signals that required adjustment. A sore joint was accommodated. Fatigue was managed. Minor injuries were simply another variable in the system. Nothing interrupted continuity. The knight's sense of self continued to narrow. Identity no longer revolved around desire or opinion. It revolved around function. He existed as part of the routine, moving with it, shaped by it, sustained by it. Individuality was unnecessary. Expression was optional. Utility was mandatory. When younger knights approached, their questions were filtered automatically. Why this drill? Why not rest? Why is it repeated? The knight did not answer verbally. He demonstrated. Motion replaced explanation. Observation replaced conversation. Participation taught lessons words could not. The system had evolved to eliminate excess. Redundancy, distraction, emotion, delay, all minimized. The night existed within its parameters as both participant and product. The environment, the schedule, the tasks, they shaped him silently. The world outside could change. Campaigns could arrive and depart. Commanders could rise and fall. Supplies could dwindle or overflow. The routine absorbed all change without disruption. The bell rang once more. Movement commenced. Breath fell into rhythm. Body and mind acted in concert, without deliberation. And the routine carried on. Steady. Indifferent. Endlessly self-sustaining, the years blurred into decades. The distinction between training and life had long since vanished. What was once effort was now motion, what was once repetition was now rhythm, what was once instruction was now instinct. The knight no longer asked why he trained. He simply did. Even the body, now weathered, continued to follow the same patterns. Each movement required less conscious thought than the last. The mind had learned to anticipate the body's needs before the body registered them. Balance, timing, endurance, alignment, all were built into muscle and bone, habitual to the point of invisibility. The environment itself had become part of the routine. Stones worn smooth by footsteps. Walls marked by years of observation. Tools that had been replaced countless times now had their own histories. Everything, from the smallest groove in the floor to the wind brushing against armor, was data. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was overlooked. Errors, when they appeared, were absorbed quietly. No internal drama. No hesitation. The system anticipated, adapted, corrected. Repetition had taught the knight that mistakes were transient, temporary disruptions, not moral failings. Correction was sufficient. Reflection was unnecessary. Time no longer held meaning in days, months, or years. Only sequence remained. Tasks flowed into one another. Drill followed drill. Meal followed rest. Movement followed stillness. Action followed observation. Everything had its place, and every place had its purpose. The knight observed younger recruits as they struggled to internalize the same patterns he had absorbed decades before. Their movements were clumsy. Their timing uncertain. Their minds restless. He did not correct them verbally. The bell rang again. The knight moved. Sequence unfolded. Breath, muscle, and attention fell into rhythm. The routine carried on. Steady. Patient. Unconcerned with meaning, reward, or end. It did not need to. It only needed to persist. The routine became a landscape unto itself. The knight moved through it not as a participant in life, but as a landmark in the system. His presence stabilized sequences, corrected deviations, and absorbed change without notice. He no longer thought of himself as acting. He simply was, and the world adjusted accordingly. Even the smallest gestures carried weight. A tilt of the head, a shift of weight, a subtle change in stance, each conveyed instruction without speech. Others unconsciously aligned with him. They did not follow because they admired. They followed because the system, and he as part of it, had already taught them the rhythms of action. The body had adapted perfectly to its environment. Muscles remembered patterns before the mind did. Bones held positions that minimized fatigue. Reflexes became anticipatory. Injuries, minor or moderate, were compensated for immediately. Recovery was built into motion itself. The knight no longer worried about age. Age was just another variable the routine accounted for. Even hunger and exhaustion were data points. The knight no longer experienced discomfort as something to resist or lament. It simply signaled an adjustment. Stretch, shift, breathe, continue. He did not think about it. He did it. Silence had become natural. Speech was reserved for the rare moments when clarification was necessary. Otherwise, the environment was filled with only movement, breath, and subtle sounds of adjustment. Noise was unnecessary. Focus was everything. Time, now, was measured not by hours or days, but by sequences completed, steps taken, breaths aligned. Long campaigns passed with the same structure as short drills. The routine did not distinguish magnitude, it distinguished sequence. The world could erupt in chaos outside the walls, but inside, continuity reigned. The knight had lost track of the number of generations of younger recruits he had trained. Faces came and went. Names faded. The routine remained constant. Observing new arrivals, he noted the inefficiency in their movements, the hesitation in their minds. He did not correct them verbally. His presence alone corrected. Efficiency transmitted silently. Sleep had changed too. The knight no longer dreamt. If images appeared, they were fragments of motion, rehearsal sequences, drills he had performed countless times. Waking was seamless. There was no grogginess, no disorientation. Action resumed immediately. Sequence never paused. Occasionally, he noticed moments of internal friction in others, anxiety, impatience, frustration. He recognized the causes instinctively: variance, indecision, expectation. These were the very experiences the system had taught him to neutralize within himself decades ago. He understood why they were disruptive. And he understood that the solution was not words, but demonstration, repetition, alignment. Even during campaigns, chaos outside the walls did not disturb him. The body, mind, and routine were one. Fatigue, hunger, injury, each absorbed silently, each accounted for, each adjusted within the sequence. Fear appeared briefly in the peripheral mind, but it could not root itself. There was no time for fear. There was only motion. Eventually, the knight realized that life itself had folded entirely into the routine. He no longer existed as a separate entity acting upon the world. He existed as a node within a continuous system, a point in a chain of movement, a stabilizing presence in the endless flow of action. Identity had dissolved into function. Thought had dissolved into motion. Emotion had dissolved into data. And still, the bell rang. And still, the body moved. And still, the sequence unfolded. The routine endured. It did not care about beginnings. It did not care about ends. It only carried on, infinitely persistent, infinitely patient. Over decades, the knight became less a person and more a function of continuity itself. Movement, balance, and observation merged until the distinction between action and actor blurred. He no longer performed the routine, he embodied it. Each step, each breath, each shift of weight carried the authority of decades of repetition. The younger recruits came and went like waves against a rock. Some stumbled. Some paused. Some attempted novelty. The knight did not interfere unnecessarily. The routine corrected them automatically. His presence alone enforced alignment. Words were rare, explanations rarer. Motion transmitted lessons more reliably than speech ever could. Time became irrelevant. Campaigns, sieges, long marches, outside noise faded. Within the routine, only sequence mattered. Repetition reinforced habit. Habit reinforced stability. Stability allowed survival. Survival was the measure of everything. The body had grown resilient in ways outsiders could not perceive. Muscles absorbed strain without complaint. Tendons memorized tension. Joints compensated for aging. Fatigue was processed as input, not problem. The knight moved with precision, conserving energy while maintaining readiness. Each adjustment was subtle, efficient, inevitable. Even sensory input had been optimized. Sounds were filtered through purpose. Movements registered without distraction. Touch, taste, and temperature were acknowledged only to inform necessary adjustment. Emotional interpretation had faded. The environment existed as data, not drama. When the night rested, the pause was functional. Sleep was rehearsal. Dreams were sequences, sometimes drills repeated, sometimes the observation of patterns in motion. Waking flowed seamlessly into action. There was no shock. No disorientation. Only continuation. The years layered over one another like sediment. Experience no longer accumulated in memory, but in action. Muscle, breath, posture, timing, these carried history. Reflection had become redundant. Observation replaced contemplation. Knowledge became instinct. Leadership existed without declaration. Authority existed without assertion. The knight's movements calibrated those around him. Alignment, correction, and rhythm transmitted silently. Influence was an emergent property, not an intention. Even danger, once terrifying, had become just another variable. Battle was processed as sequences: movement, response, adjustment. Fear appeared briefly, like a ripple on water, then dissipated, leaving only efficient action. Survival had no emotion, it had only precision. At times, the knight noticed fragments of thoughts from a past self, questions, desires, curiosities. They were strange and distant, almost like echoes from another person. Yet they caused no distraction. The routine absorbed them effortlessly. Novelty had no foothold. Emotion had no leverage. Only sequence remained. The bell rang again. Movement resumed. Sequence unfolded. Breath, muscle, attention, perfectly synchronized. The knight was no longer a man moving through the day. He was a point in a system, a stabilizing node in an endless chain of continuity. Function had become identity. Motion had become thought. Sequence had become time. The routine persisted. Indifferent. Patient. Endlessly self-sustaining. Decades of repetition had transformed the knight's perception of everything. Time no longer flowed as minutes or hours, but as chains of motion and sequences of breath. Each day was indistinguishable from the last, yet subtly different, variations imperceptible to the untrained mind, but noticed instinctively. The body had become a perfect recorder of habit. Muscles remembered tension before the mind registered it. Tendons responded before thought arrived. Even joints moved with anticipatory precision. Pain was a variable, discomfort a signal, both processed and accounted for immediately. The knight no longer reacted, he adjusted. Instinct and routine merged seamlessly. Younger recruits continued to flail through hesitation and indecision. The knight watched. He did not correct them verbally. His body spoke instead. A shift in stance. A subtle adjustment in timing. A demonstration of motion. Observation became the teaching tool, participation the lesson. Time itself had become irrelevant. Days passed, but only as sequences completed, drills finished, breaths aligned. The outside world could erupt in chaos, wars, famine, political upheaval, but inside the routine, none of it mattered. Only continuation mattered. Sleep was functional, not restorative. Dreams occurred, but they were not narratives. They were sequences, drills repeated, steps retraced, balance recalculated. Waking was seamless, a continuation of the rehearsal that had begun in sleep. There was no disorientation. Only motion. Even emotion had faded to near invisibility. Joy, fear, curiosity, these arose as faint echoes, quickly absorbed by the system. Excitement had no place to land. Anxiety could not root itself. The knight's mind had been trimmed of distraction. Thought and action were aligned. Motivation was irrelevant, the routine was sufficient, the knight moved through environments as if they were extensions of himself. Stones, walls, tools, and equipment had become components in a vast machine of motion and sequence. He did not consider them separately. They existed to be interacted with. He moved accordingly. Leadership no longer required speech. It existed through presence, through rhythm. Those around him unconsciously aligned with his pace, mirrored his timing, absorbed his steadiness. Influence was emergent, invisible, unspoken. Authority needed no claim because it was inherent in motion. Even danger, when it arose, became data. The heart might accelerate, muscles might tighten, vision might narrow, but panic no longer existed. Sequences adapted. Movements anticipated. Repetition had trained the body to respond before fear could take root. Survival was pure mechanics. Years layered like sediment in the night's memory, though memory itself had shifted. Events were no longer stored as stories, but as muscle patterns, posture, rhythm. History became motion. Lessons became instinct. Reflection was unnecessary. Observation sufficed. Hunger, fatigue, minor injury, these were processed as signals, not problems. Adjustments occurred silently. Recovery was built into motion. The body, mind, and routine formed a single adaptive system. Nothing was wasted. Nothing distracted. Everything persisted. The bell rang. The night moved. Sequence unfolded. Breath aligned with motion. Muscles acted automatically. The body remembered before the mind noticed that he no longer existed as an individual acting upon the routine. He existed as part of the routine itself. Function had replaced identity. Motion had replaced thought. Continuity had replaced time. The routine endured. Indifferent. Patient. Infinite, the routine had become a landscape the night inhabited rather than a set of tasks to complete. Each motion, each breath, each adjustment had long since been internalized. There was no question of whether it would be done, it simply was done, without deliberation, without thought, without hesitation. Even the passing of younger knights, the rise and fall of commanders, the shifting of orders, the chaos of campaigns beyond the walls, these were irrelevant. They did not alter the system. They were simply variations passing around a fixed center. The knight's body and mind continued unbroken, absorbing disturbances like water flowing around stones. Pain, fatigue, and hunger were processed as input, not experience. If a joint ached, the body adjusted. If muscles were tight, they stretched. If the stomach protested, the sequence continued. These signals were neither complaints nor instructions, they were data to be incorporated seamlessly. The knight observed patterns everywhere. The rhythm of marching, the flow of training, the cadence of breath and step, these were threads in a tapestry that existed beyond awareness. Motion was woven into motion, and the observer was embedded inside the weave. No narrative existed, only alignment. Even sleep obeyed the same principles. Dreams were not stories, they were rehearsals, repetitions, simulations. Waking flowed from dreaming without pause. Transition required no effort. Sequence never ceased. Emotion had largely faded. What remained was attention. Precision. Anticipation. A subtle awareness of deviation. Excitement, frustration, fear, they were momentary flickers, quickly extinguished by habitual movement. Thought followed function. Desire followed necessity. Motivation was irrelevant. Only action mattered. When younger knights faltered, the older knight's presence corrected them. A shift of weight, a subtle demonstration of timing, a silent adjustment, this was all that was needed. Correction did not require words, only embodiment of the pattern. Influence was transmitted silently, without intention, time had become meaningless. Days, months, years were abstractions. Only sequences existed, the progression of drills, the alignment of movement, the completion of cycles. Change outside the routine, weather, campaign, political shifts, was irrelevant. Continuity absorbed all variations. Even danger became data. The body responded before fear arrived. Movement compensated before threat registered. Survival was no longer an instinct, it was the default state. Reflex replaced reflection, repetition replaced reaction. The bell rang. Movement resumed. Breath, balance, and muscle acted in perfect harmony. The night no longer existed as a separate entity. He was the routine. Sequence had replaced identity. Continuity had replaced time. Function had replaced thought. And still, the routine persisted. Indifferent. Patient. Infinite. The night's awareness had narrowed to an almost imperceptible focus, yet it encompassed everything necessary. He noticed the subtlest deviations in rhythm, the staggered footfall of a younger recruit, the shift of weight in response to uneven ground, the micro-adjustments of armor settling against muscle. These were all recorded, processed, and accounted for before conscious thought could intervene. Movement was language. Posture, timing, and repetition communicated more than words ever could. A tilt of the head corrected alignment. A step placed slightly ahead adjusted balance. A pause indicated caution. Influence flowed through the body, transmitted without intention, absorbed without discussion. The system itself was the teacher, and the night embodied its lessons. Even time itself had become secondary to sequence. Days, months, and years were meaningless in comparison to continuity. Campaigns began and ended, commanders rose and fell, but the routine endured, indifferent to circumstance. Only the rhythm mattered, only the progression of motion and breath and attention. Sleep had been reduced to rehearsal. The night's mind did not wander. Dreams were simulations, drills repeated, sequences refined, balance and timing tested. Waking flowed seamlessly from rest. There was no grogginess, no disruption, no distinction between rest and action, only continuation. Emotion was nearly absent. Excitement, fear, frustration, and joy appeared briefly, only to be absorbed by the flow of motion. Motivation was irrelevant. Desire was unnecessary. The system demanded only participation. Sequence replaced intent. Movement replaced feeling. Continuity replaced time. The bell rang again. The body responded without hesitation. Breath, posture, and muscle aligned automatically. Motion unfolded like a river flowing without end. Even observation had changed. The night no longer watched to interpret or to judge. He observed to integrate. Every shift in terrain, every change in recruit's stance, every subtle variation in rhythm was noted, processed, and incorporated into the ongoing flow. Awareness had become an extension of the body, as seamless as breath. Pain, fatigue, and hunger existed only as variables. The body adjusted. Muscles compensated. Posture corrected. Energy conserved. Nothing was wasted. Nothing distracted. Continuity absorbed all interruptions effortlessly. The younger recruits looked to him, sensing stability without understanding why. Presence alone corrected hesitation. Alignment flowed naturally. Motion guided them silently. Leadership had become invisible. Authority was inherent in rhythm, even when danger arrived, fear had no foothold. Reflex and habit carried the night through it. Movement preceded perception. Survival was mechanical. There was no panic, no second-guessing, no hesitation. The system had trained him to respond before the mind could question. The night realized, at some level, that he no longer existed independently. He was a point in a chain of motion, a node in a structure that had no beginning and no end. Function had replaced identity. Motion had replaced thought. Sequence had replaced time. Continuity had replaced self. The routine persisted. Indifferent. Patient. Infinite. The night's perception of the world had merged entirely with the routine. There was no distinction between self and system, between actor and environment. Stones, walls, armor, tools, even the rhythm of wind or distant noise, everything existed as part of a vast, continuous flow. Input arrived. Motion responded. Correction was immediate. Sequence never paused. The body had become a repository of centuries of repetition. Muscles anticipated tension. Joints adjusted automatically. Breath aligned with step before thought intervened. Fatigue, hunger, minor injury, these were simply variables to be accommodated, not obstacles. Nothing interrupted the flow. Nothing distracted. Everything was accounted for. Observation had become instinct. The knight noticed imbalance in others as easily as he felt pressure in his own knees. Deviations were corrected not by words, but by subtle adjustments in motion. Presence alone was sufficient to stabilize. Influence was emergent, invisible, absolute. Even emotion had little place. Excitement, fear, frustration, and joy appeared only briefly, as flickers, and were absorbed by the routine. Motivation was unnecessary. Desire had no foothold. Thought and action were aligned. Continuity was all. Sleep existed as rehearsal, not narrative. The knight dreamed in motion, drills repeated, steps rehearsed, balance tested. Waking flowed seamlessly from rest. There was no transition. There was only continuation. Time itself was irrelevant. Campaigns began and ended. Commanders rose and fell. Generations of recruits arrived and departed. The knight remained constant, a stabilizing node in a system that ignored the passage of years. Only sequence mattered: motion, breath, balance, alignment. Even danger was absorbed without drama. The body responded before fear could arise. Movement anticipated perception. Survival was default, instinctive, inevitable. Reflex replaced reaction, repetition replaced panic. The younger knights struggled, unaware of the system that guided them. They hesitated, misstepped, questioned. The older knight corrected silently. A tilt of the head. A step forward. A shift of weight. Motion conveyed lessons without words. Participation taught what explanation never could. Eventually, the knight realized that identity had become irrelevant. He was no longer a person navigating life. He was a point within a system, a node in an endless chain of continuity. Function replaced self. Motion replaced thought. Sequence replaced time. Continuity replaced everything. The bell rang. The knight moved. Sequence unfolded. Breath, muscle, posture, all in perfect alignment. The routine endured. Indifferent. Patient. Infinite. The knight's existence had narrowed to pure sequence. There was no anticipation of tomorrow, no memory of yesterday, only the present flow of action, measured and precise. Motion had become thought, thought had become motion. The world was a lattice of rhythms, and he was both participant and stabilizing point. Even the young recruits had become part of the pattern. Hesitation and error appeared, were absorbed, and corrected by the silent authority of the routine. Presence alone taught. Adjustment alone instructed. Words were unnecessary. The system transmitted itself through action, repetition, alignment. The body, weathered and aged, had become self-regulating. Muscles knew tension before the mind noticed. Joints shifted without deliberation. Fatigue arrived and dissipated as a variable, not a hindrance. Pain was processed, compensated for, and incorporated seamlessly. The knight no longer thought about endurance. He simply endured. Sleep remained functional. Dreams were sequences repeated, rehearsals of motion, practice embedded in rest. Waking flowed without interruption. There was no disorientation. There was only continuation. Time had lost all meaning. Campaigns began and ended. Commanders rose and fell. Generations of recruits came and went. Yet the routine persisted. It ignored history, politics, and chaos. Only rhythm mattered. Only motion mattered. Only continuity mattered. Even emotion had faded to a flicker. Fear, excitement, curiosity, frustration, all absorbed, neutralized. Motivation was irrelevant. Desire unnecessary. The knight did not act because he wanted to, he acted because the system required it. Sequence replaced intention. Motion replaced thought. Continuity replaced self. Danger appeared as data. The body responded before perception registered. Reflex replaced panic. Survival was automatic, inevitable, unconscious. Observation had become instinctual. Deviations in movement or timing among others were noted and absorbed before disruption could spread. Correction occurred silently, through presence and alignment. Leadership had become invisible. Authority had become emergent. Influence existed without intention. The knight realized he no longer existed as a separate being. He was part of the routine itself. Function was identity. Motion was thought. Sequence was time. Continuity was all. The bell rang. The body moved. Sequence unfolded. Breath, balance, and posture synchronized perfectly. The routine endured. Indifferent. Patient. Infinite.